Director Mitchell.
It shows she's on. I hear somebody talking in the background, but I don't see your picture.
That meeting yesterday, with all these meetings we had, you know,
I think that might be her voice I'm hearing. Okay, I think we'll just go ahead and move forward. Dr. Saltzman, can you introduce this morning's agenda, please?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, Madam Chair, and good morning, Board of Directors. This morning's agenda contains an opportunity for board members to receive training from Attorney Buzz Porter on the roles and responsibilities of board members in collective bargaining and to attend a closed session regarding current bargaining negotiations. Since publishing the agenda, no changes have been made.
Okay, that's pretty simple and straightforward. I'm not sure who's kicking us off this morning.
Debbie?
I'm happy to, yes. Thank you, President Mason. I'm pleased to have Buzz Porter here to walk you through some training. He's been our lead negotiator for quite some time and has a great deal of history, so I think you'll find this to be a fruitful training. And I want to introduce Mandy Shin, who is our Director of Classified. You'll see here. She leads our negotiations and labor relations with our classified groups. So with that, Buzz, you can kick it off.
Terrific, and good morning. I did last week forward copies of the slides that I'll be using today. I'm not sure if they made it out to everybody. I thought what I would try to do, we'll see if I can get screen sharing to work, and I can actually show you the slides as I'm walking through them, the outline of what we want to cover today. So the theme of today is roles and responsibilities of board members. We're obviously not doing a training on how to bargain or all of the details that might go into doing a good bargain. We're really going to focus in on what the role of board members are in that process. One of the things that I usually say before I do any training is that I would much rather answer the questions you actually have than just the ones I'm guessing that you have. So I do want you to ask questions throughout. I actually do find it a little more fun for all of us when you take us down some dead end and I have a challenge to get us back to the outline. So please feel free to ask questions throughout. I'll do my best to keep an eye on all of the screens to see if anybody has a question along the way. And with that, where I want to start, I am a lawyer, so I usually start with the law. I start with sort of what are the outlines of what we have to do and what we can do. And where we start then with that legal framework, there are two sources of law in Washington for bargaining. In the private sector nationally, there's just one law, the National Labor Relations Act. But in Washington, we actually didn't give bargaining rights to public employees until much later. Classified employees got a right to bargain in 1969, and they passed a chapter of our RCW's 4156. They did not give full bargaining rights to our certificated employees until 1976. And so there's actually a separate statute, 4159, for our certificated employees. The statutes are very similar. There are a couple of very minor differences that we only have to worry about in very rare circumstances, but it is important to note that there are two different statutes. So not everything that applies to classified bargaining also applies to certificated. Both of those statutes were modeled after the National Labor Relations Act, and so a lot of the general bargaining labor law of the nation will also apply in Washington. It's just, it is technically a different law. It's not the same law and it's not enforced the same way. So it's similar to what we know as the NLRA. The biggest exception, the biggest difference from the NLRA is in the public sector, there is no right to strike. And you may say, how is that true? You've heard of teacher strikes. Yes, teacher strikes actually occur. It is the term that we know as civil disobedience. There are things that are so important to people, they are willing to violate a law to do it. And that's true of very many important principles in life. And that happens to be true with unions in Washington, is if something is important enough, they will strike anyway, even if there is no right to strike in our collective bargaining law. It's administered by an agency. We have a state agency called the Public Employment Relations Commission, PERC. It's a state agency. The state pays for it, so we aren't charged anything for their services. They have a couple of significant duties. One, they conduct all the elections. So when a union wants to be the exclusive bargaining rep for a group, PERC is the one who will come in and conduct an election of the employees. Most of our public employees, particularly in schools, are already organized into bargaining units, and so we don't see that many elections. We have, during my 20 years working in Everett, I noticed that I think we've had one election. The other thing that they do is adjudicate disputes between groups. So if someone believes that the other party is actually violating the law, doing an unfair labor practice, PERC is also the agency that would give us a hearing officer to have a hearing determine if that's true. And the last thing they do is also mediate. When we're collective bargaining and we can't reach an agreement, they will send in a mediator if we request one to help us try to reach an agreement. It's a little bit different than how the National Labor Relations Act works, because they actually have two different agencies in the federal government, and they separate these duties. They have the National Labor Relations Board that handles the elections and disputes. Then they have the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service that handles mediations. So they separate those on the federal level. At our state level, they put them together. And the hearing officers that hold the hearings are also the same people that do mediations. So we go to PERC when we have a dispute about this law or when we need mediators to come in. Also in the legal framework, the employer's legal duty to bargain. Basically, I can sum the entire statute up, and of course it's a law, so it's 7 or 8 pages long, but the entire law can be summed up in one sentence. Employers have a duty to bargain, mandatory subjects of bargaining. So let's break apart that sentence. What does it mean? What's the legal duty to bargain? What does that mean? First, we have to bargain in good faith. That's the judicial gloss on that statute. It doesn't actually say good faith in the statute, but the courts have interpreted that. When it says a duty to bargain, it means we have to bargain in good faith. That means we have to be available. We can't say we're not going to meet with the other side. That's part of bargaining in good faith, is being available to bargain. You have to make and respond to proposals. I can't just say, I'm not going to tell you whether I like your proposal or not. You actually have to tell them whether you agree or disagree with something, and you have to make counter proposals. You have no duty to capitulate or agree, however. So the duty to respond is not a duty to agree. And obviously, people you disagree with point often. They often think that if you just tell them no, they're not responding. And well, no is a legitimate response. You can say no, and that is responding to a proposal. And trust me, the unions know how to do that. They say no to our proposals quite a bit. So there is no duty to agree, but you do have a duty to make and respond to proposals. Usually when it comes to good faith or bad faith bargaining, most of the time they focus on what is bad faith. And there is no one thing that would be bad faith, but they will look at a variety of factors, circumstances to determine whether somebody really wasn't trying to get a deal. And so things like mixed messages. So if on day one, I tell them that I'm willing to give a 5% raise, and then I come back on day 2 and say, whoops, nope, I was wrong, only 3% today. That would be a mixed message. Or if I told them, I can give you a raise if you agree to our proposal on sick leave. And then the next day I tell them, no, I can't agree to that proposal for a raise. That would be a mixed message. A deceptive practice would be not telling the truth at the table, like telling them, oh, we only have 1% in our fund balance when we all know we have 5% in our fund balance. The regressive bargaining is the one that people focus on the most. And that's when you're going backwards in your proposals. So once you make a certain position, like we will do a 1% raise, it's seen as regressive or not trying to get a deal if you come back the next day and say only 0.5% and not a full percent. So you have to be pretty careful when you're making a proposal, because you can't go backwards from the proposals that you make. That is seen as regressive. I will say, as an experienced bargainer, there are technical ways to do it, because you can make package bargains and then go backwards out of a package. So if I tell them I can do 5% if you agree to give up all of your professional development money, and the next day I can come back, and because they didn't agree to that, I can say, okay, you didn't give up your professional development money, so now I'm only going to do 4%. That's not a regressive proposal, because the initial one was tied together as a package. So, and people can mistake that as well. And so I often have to explain why something is not regressive. So we know we have a duty to bargain in good faith. What do we have to bargain? The world of bargaining is basically organized into 3 categories. All the subjects you could bargain. There are mandatory subjects, there are permissive subjects, and then there are illegal subjects. Mandatory subjects are defined by the phrase wages, hours, and working conditions. So if something falls within one of those three, it's about wages, it's about hours, or it's about working conditions, we have to bargain it. If they request bargaining, we have to bargain. Almost everything else in the world is permissive if it's outside of those three categories. There is not much that is outside of those three categories, particularly that last one, working conditions. That one is interpreted very broadly. And even when PERC, our agency, has said that something is not a mandatory subject, a lot of unions will still try to call it a mandatory subject by calling it a working condition. So even something that would be very clearly not within their bargaining unit. For example, I have teachers who all the time make proposals about classified staffing because they want more paraeducators in their room. And we don't usually want to bargain over classified staffing with our certificated unit. It's a whole totally different union than that would be driving the staffing for a different union. But the teachers will make an argument that having the paraeducator in their class is a working condition. It impacts who else they have there to help them supervise students. And so they do push their way into, by using that working conditions category, to make a lot of things into a mandatory subject of bargaining. In Washington, this is an area, what is something mandatory or permissive, that is litigated quite often over the years. And I will say 75 to 80% of the time, PERC will find that something is mandatory. There is very little that is not considered mandatory.
Hey, Buzz, did you say we can ask questions as we go along?
Please do.
I have a question about that. Where does things like curriculum and not state, but district required assessment come in?
We believe that the selection of the curriculum itself should be not a mandatory subject. It would be a permissive subject. It's something that is clearly within the authority, and there's a statute that says on curriculum in particular that the board has to approve curriculum. So we think you couldn't delegate that, even if you wanted to delegate that to a union. The unions will argue there are pieces of curriculum that have an impact on their working conditions. So if you were to adopt a curriculum that, for example, required them to do twice as much planning, or in their minds, requires twice as much assessment, and they think that changes the working conditions for them and the amount of papers they have to grade, the type of homework that they have to give, they will make an argument, and they often win with PERC, to say that even though the subject of whether you choose curriculum A or curriculum B may not be mandatory, you still have to bargain the impact of that decision.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one further question on that topic. So what if the district adopts a curriculum and we are requiring it to be used district-wide at, certain grade bands, and a teacher thinks that the curriculum that they already have and have been using is better, and so they choose not to do that? How does that affect this?
Generally, they don't have a right to pick their own curriculum. So we could direct them to use the board adopted curriculum.
Okay.
The union can make a demand to bargain over the impacts of that decision.
Okay.
So if they feel, for example, that the curriculum we chose takes more planning time, they could come back and say, okay, we now want to change, instead of having 60 minutes of planning time a day, one period, we want to have 2 periods of planning. And that's what they would bargain for. But they could not bargain you must select the other curriculum. They will try, because that could be a permissive subject. You could always agree if you wanted to, but it's not a mandatory subject. So they may still make a proposal that we don't like the Houghton Mifflin curriculum that you've chosen. We want to go with a different curriculum. They could propose that. We wouldn't have to bargain that, but we would have to bargain any impacts of our decision. One I just dealt with in the last week, I have a district that's switching from being a Microsoft platform for Microsoft Teams as use of classrooms over to Google Classroom. And it's a change in a platform that we clearly believe is not a mandatory subject. It's a management right to determine the operating system we're going to use. But the teachers in that district made a demand to bargain the impacts, that if we're switching from Microsoft to Google Classroom, they wanted training, for example. And so they will bargain to get training in the new curriculum.
Okay, thanks for the clarity.
Yep.
And this is Tracy, just another point of clarity for that. If I remember correctly, historically, we had given our PE teams the right to determine their own curriculum. And Debbie, I know there have been talk about bringing that back into the curriculum team, but it was in their contract. PE, I might be remembering it wrong, but that somehow, like, again, PE got to determine their own curriculum. It didn't follow under teaching and learning. Is and that was in the contract.
Yeah, I don't
Can
know
you
what it is
clarify if that's
currently.
been removed or is important?
So I have a memory of bargaining over that issue at some point in the last 10 years. And there was a point in time when we were piloting new curriculum. And at that time, I think we gave teachers some flexibility of whether they wanted to join the pilot and try the new curriculum or stick with whatever they were using before. I think after the pilot was conducted, at some point in time, we did make a decision as to what curriculum we wanted to use. That's all I'm remembering on that issue. Is there was a period of time, I know elementary PE teachers in particular had some flexibility on which curriculum they wanted to use while we were piloting, and it was controversial. Some of them didn't like the new curriculum. And I think that's the compromise we made at the time, is not making everybody pilot the new curriculum.
Buzz, I have one question for you. In this environment that we are in right now, we've required teachers to go to virtual classrooms and things along those lines. Could they essentially have come back and said we needed to bargain that because it changes the working conditions for each and every teacher, because teachers now have to work from home and it's a different location? And should we be in a situation where all this that we're doing, we should have bargained?
I won't say should have bargained, but yes, unions did make in some districts a demand to bargain this. It obviously was very unusual circumstances with an order from the governor. And if any of you remember those particular press conferences, this was an odd time in my life. I actually have to interpret press conference comments instead of laws now. But there were a lot of comments from our governor urging unions to be more flexible. He could not require them to because they could make a demand to bargain. But being a good member of the Democratic Party with a lot of support from unions, he was trying to pull a few strings and ask them to please be flexible and not give districts a hard time over this switch, because he knew it would be very difficult if they had to bargain over it. In some districts where I am working, however, we did receive a demand to bargain, and we did have to negotiate over certain working conditions. And I'm still doing that in many districts as new issues have come up, trying to deliver services for special education students. When does a teacher have to come to the campus to do that? When can they do it from home? How often do they have to talk to that student? What do we do with things like evaluations? I know that's something that Debbie worked on with EEA. What do we do with teacher evaluations during this time? So there was negotiating and bargaining going on about the impacts of the governor's decision to close schools.
So Pam, we have been able, that was a very good question, and Buzz did a nice job of answering it. Because of our great relationships with our EEA and our other associations, we have been able to work through these types of situations without, going with it, without a demand to bargain with our union groups thus far. So as Buzz said, we've been working through the working conditions pieces of it, particularly with the virtual part with teachers, and it has been very positive so far.
What's worked out well for us, the staff has met with the unions twice a week. So there's really thorough communications through this process.
I think it's a very interesting observation to see how well this has gone in Everett. I will be honest with you. If I go back 20 years and what the labor relationships were like then, the unions did not believe in just having conversations about things. They wanted to negotiate and write everything into an agreement. There are other places in the state where we still have that relationship.
Can they come back later and say, because we've had discussions and meetings on this, can they come back and then require us to bargain after the fact on any item?
Yes. If at some point in time our discussions do not result in something that they agree with, they could make a demand to bargain at that time. We would have to look at the particular subject as to what they're asking about. So for example, if they were demanding to come back to schools and deliver instruction in person, that would right now be an illegal proposal because we have a governor's order that has closed schools. So we would not bargain over that, bargain to bring teachers back. But we would bargain with them if they make a demand about the impacts of the teaching from home, and they wanted to bargain about how many times they have to check in with students, how much work they're doing. Yes, we may have to bargain over that if they were to make a demand to bargain. They all know it's temporary. And I think that was their assumption coming in, is that this is all temporary. And so I think that they have been very responsible in trying to focus their time, not too much on something that is going to be temporary.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yep. So as I mentioned, mandatory is wages, hours, and working conditions. And even if something is not mandatory, we may still have to bargain the impacts of that particular decision if it's a permissive topic. So we know we have to bargain in good faith. We know we have to bargain mandatory subjects. The next question is, who do we have to bargain with? And that's, we have to bargain with the exclusive bargaining rep. That is the person that has been elected by the members to be the one group with whom you can bargain. We do not have a choice to bargain with individual employees, nor do we have a choice to have multiple unions for our certificated group. In the state of Washington, you're only allowed to have one bargaining representative for the certificated bargaining unit. Prior to 76, in Everett actually had a very unusual situation, and there's not much history of it left, but I had to deal with some history for about 30 years. Everett had two unions prior to 1976. There was the United Teachers of Everett, and there was the Everett Education Association. So there were two different unions. But when they passed that bargaining statute in 76 that gave them bargaining rights, they had to merge. And so the official title of the union here for many, many years, until just within the last 5 years, actually had a slash in it, because they were called the Everett Education Association / United Teachers of Everett, because they used to have two unions many, many years ago. They're now unified as one group. They are the exclusive bargaining rep. You can't bargain directly with employees. You can't go around the bargaining rep. One has been elected. We have to deal with whoever they send to the table. I can't say I don't like their union leaders. They get to pick the union leaders, and I can't go around them and talk directly to members. Similarly, they can't go around who you send to the table. The one exception to that is that you are elected officials, and people have a constitutional right to address their elected officials. So I can't stop union people from making political statements at board meetings, from sending information to you. I can't stop people from addressing their publicly elected leaders. However, I can tell them they can't bargain with you. They have to bargain with whoever you send to the table. So if you send Mandy and me to the table to be your representatives, that's who they have to bargain with.
And so Buzz, are you still recommending against some districts that have started bringing board members into that bargaining room? Are you still sort of suggesting we don't do that?
Yes, I've tried that a couple of times, and I probably shared this story twice in my career. If I've been at the table when a board member has been sent by the board to sit in the meeting, I will tell you both of mine were negative experiences, and you could chalk it up to the individuals involved. One time they made it a very political, and I think this would happen anytime I bring a board member, is that it would turn very, very political, trying to get that board member to commit to something because they know that person has to be elected again. And it'd be very hard, I think, also for everybody else on the district bargaining team to say anything and be very creative in their thinking or transparent at the table when they have their boss sitting in front of them right there. My other example, bargaining is not all that exciting if you were to actually spend a lot of time doing it. And so my other experience is I had a bargaining team member who was a board member who fell asleep at the table. And that obviously set a very bad tone for the meeting. When you're falling asleep in front of the other team, it kind of sends a message that what they were saying isn't all that important. So those have been my two experiences, is that bargaining is either too boring for board members or it becomes too political. Each side, as I mentioned, gets to determine who comes and represents them. What happens if you can't reach an agreement? Sort of the last legal question I like to answer. What are the options or the consequences of failing to get an agreement? Number one, you can go to mediation when you reach impasse. When you're at a point where you can't make any more progress, that's when you can call in a mediator. And PERC, I know the people down at PERC really well, and they have told me many times, call us in earlier rather than later. They say, don't wait till necessarily you get to impasse. If you think you're going to get to that spot, give us a call and we'll come in. They are, very professional in what they do. They come free. And my joke about PERC is you get what you pay for. I have never found in bringing in a PERC mediator that they solve any problems for us, particularly because my one favorite mediator is a very good friend of mine who will not do any mediations that I'm involved with because we're too good of friends. So the one mediator I would trust the most, I can't bring into any of my bargains. Most everybody else, I will use them, a mediator, when I can't anymore communicate with the other side. If communication is broken down, that they're no longer listening to me, or I don't want to listen to them anymore, I can bring in a mediator, and pretty much all they do is pass messages back and forth for us. It's sort of, we call shuttle diplomacy. They put the two teams in different rooms, and they will pass the proposals back and forth. So at least we're not at the table yelling at each other anymore. Not that I've ever done that.
Does the does the other side have to agree to mediation, or can you just call in the mediator?
So when you reach impasse, you can just call for a mediator. It's often better to call for it jointly. What happens when you call it unilaterally, a mediator will come in and the other side will just stonewall and not say anything to the mediator, and that's not really helpful either. So generally we try whenever possible when we go to mediation, and I can only think of one time maybe in the last 10 years where I've gone to mediation. And it was very much, I usually meet in a sidebar with the leader of the other team and I say, I think we ought to go to mediation. Let's jointly request a mediator. And when you jointly request, you can usually pick which mediator you want. And since I know all 20 of them, I can be a little more picky about which one comes in to help us, who I think would be more helpful. So I try to do it jointly, even though we could do it unilaterally. In the certificated statute, not the classified one of the few differences in that statute is they have another procedure when you reach impasse called fact finding. It's an ability to basically present your best proposal to an impartial third party, maybe somebody PERC appoints, and the other side will present their proposal, and then there will be a non-binding decision that is issued as to who has the better proposal. It's just a fact finding. It has no binding impact. Because of that, I have not found it has been used because it becomes a show trial. It becomes basically publicity, and then you're fighting in the public over who has the better proposal, trying to embarrass the other side to back down. And I have not found that to be a very effective procedure. Embarrassing the other side usually makes them dig in, not give in. And so I usually do just the opposite in my bargaining. I try to actually make it easier for them, less embarrassing for them to back off of a proposal I can't agree with. So I don't choose fact finding. I think the last time fact finding was used in Washington might have been the early 1980s. I know Everett one time did use it in the late 70s. Because it's non-binding, however, you can't really it doesn't get you anywhere. You still have to reach the agreement yourself. Even if the fact finder finds that yours is the better proposal, I still have to get the other side to agree with that. But I'd much rather spend my time trying to get that agreement than putting on a show trial. Technically, if we reach impasse and we've tried everything to get an agreement, an employer is allowed to unilaterally implement their last, best, and final offer. That's a technical thing under the law that we can do. Generally, that's what would trigger a strike from the union. That's their only response because they know that we can unilaterally implement. So that's the time when they will try civil disobedience. In Everett, the last time that they got to this place that they were going to unilaterally implement, they didn't go on strike, but they did something they call non-participation, which was basically in the private world what we would know as a sick out. They'd basically be doing everything possible to make life difficult for us without going on strike. And it was before my time. I think it was 1997 was the year they did that, 97 or 98. We still have a few people in the district left who remember those times, and it was pretty ugly because it was things like teachers looking at the clock, and as soon as their workday hour was over, they all got up and left. They would walk out of whatever meeting they were in, and they, of course, made it very difficult for anybody else not to do that. So it became very divisive even within the membership. So that's the those are the options. I generally find that I don't go to unilateral implementation. I just I tell myself that failure is not an option, and I keep bargaining until I reach an agreement. And I have found over 275 times now, every single contract settles at some point. Even Marysville School District next to you there, who is famous for having the longest strike in the state of Washington, they settled. And they have been settled much longer than they were on strike. And so when I bargain, I always remember that, to bargain for that longer period of time. Don't bargain to win a strike. You bargain to get an agreement because that is going to be a much longer period of time you're living with somebody. So that's how I deal with impasse, is just by continuing to bargain and never, ever giving up and trying to reach an agreement. That's the legal framework. I'm going to jump from there into the bargaining process and make sure you understand there are sort of 355 different ways to bargain, but you can mostly all of them will fall on two sides, two sort of extremes. One I will call the traditional bargaining process, and the other we call the interest-based process. And almost everybody is somewhere in between. No one does a pure form of either. What a traditional bargaining process would look like, you'd come together and you exchange initial proposals in writing on all the issues or changes that you want in the CBA. You then will ask questions about the proposal that they just gave you, if anything's unclear to you. You then go with your team back into a caucus, we call it. So you separate out, and then our team looks at the proposal and decides, we hate A, B, and C, but we can do D if we do it a little bit differently. We write a counter proposal, and then we come in and we exchange counter proposals with the other team. So we're going to say no to your first 3 issues. We're going to say yes to the 4th one, and the 5th one, we have a different idea for you. And we give them a counter proposal. They then take that and they go off into a caucus room and figure out what they can agree with. Then they come back and give us their written counter proposal. And you keep exchanging counter proposals, working from separate rooms and just coming together to exchange written proposals. That's the very traditional. When you reach an agreement on one of those issues, you call that a tentative agreement, and you set that issue aside. And you keep trying to basically narrow the number of issues that are up on the table. Worst case scenario, so it would have been like the 2006 bargain in Everett with the teachers. I think we had about 125 issues we were working on at that time on the table in their proposal. And that's how we did it, one at a time, just trying to get an agreement on each and every issue. Generally, you'll get down to the last few that all have to do with money, because they're the toughest ones for people to find a solution on, and often you will package them. I think in that particular year, we ended up packaging maybe the last 10 or 15 issues together as a package, because it was going to require them to back off of some things that they wanted and for us to make movement on things we didn't want to make movement on, so we put it in a package. When you have a tentative agreement on all of the issues, you then have an entire package of TAs, tentative agreements. That then has to go to our ratifying body. That's you. So you ratify them on behalf of the district. They take that to their membership. So all 1,000 members have to get together and vote on whether they will accept the tentative agreement. And when it's ratified, then it's put into a contract form, and that is when it's a full CBA, collective bargaining agreement. That's the traditional process. There is a different way of reaching agreements. It's called an interest-based process, and I explain it with 2 parables and 1 metaphor. First, the parable of the orange. There was a parent who had 1 orange left in the house and 2 children who both wanted the last orange. Of course, the children are fighting over the orange, and so the parent takes a knife, slices the orange in half, and gives 1/2 to either side. One child comes up very upset still and says, "Why did you do that, Mom? Don't you know I needed the juice from a full orange for this cake recipe that I was making for school?" And the other child comes in and says, "Mom, I'm upset because I needed the rind from a full orange for this art project that I happen to be working on." The lesson being there that if the parent had asked the question in advance, "Why did you want an orange?" the parent could have resolved and given both sides what they needed. One child could have gotten the juice from a full orange, the other child could have gotten the rind from the full orange. So the lesson from that parable is to ask the question why. When somebody is giving you a demand or a proposal, ask why they want it. Because asking that why question may give us a different way to meet a need other than the way that they're demanding it be met. An example in bargaining on the why question would be somebody comes in and says, "I need a 10% raise." Okay, that's a nice proposal, great. I don't think I can afford a 10% raise. So what I ask is why? Why do you need a 10% raise? And that may get at things like, well, our heating costs have gone up this year because it was a really bad winter. And so then I can go and brainstorm with my team. Is there a different way for me to address the escalation in heating costs other than giving a 10% raise? Maybe I can negotiate a special public school employee rate with the local utility. And that would be a different way of trying to meet their need other than giving a 10% raise that I can't afford. So it's asking that why question becomes very important. The metaphor that I use is the onion. An onion has layers. So does that question why. Often we have to ask the question why multiple times to get at the core of what is the real issue they're trying to solve. So if I ask that first question about the 10% raise, why do you need a 10% raise? It could be, well, because my costs have gone up. Well, why have your costs gone up? Well, because we had a really bad winter that was extra cold. Well, why was it really cold? Oh, because of global warming. And pretty soon I can get to a place that maybe I can't solve, but I can start to understand what the problem is, and it will help me brainstorm at different options. So you keep peeling back layers of the onion by asking that why question multiple times. But also like the onion, you will find that often, if you peel back all of the onion, there is no core. It is just layers. That is all that it is. And my lesson from that is at some point in time, you have to stop asking the question why and just deal with the issue. So at some point, I have to stop asking why. The other parable I use is the story of the bears. It's a story when I was told that comes out of Minnesota, although somebody has Googled it on the internet and believes it's a true story, actually out of the North Cascades here in Washington. It's a story about actually electrical line workers. Those are the people who keep the electrical lines up during storms. So when storms bring the lines down, they have to go and put the electrical lines back up. During the winter, one of the big dangers other than a storm is that icicles will form on the electrical lines and weigh down the lines and eventually break them. And so one of the things they have to do, even when there's not a storm and the power's out, is they have to go out there and knock the icicles off of the electrical lines. And where those electrical lines are in the North Cascades or in Minnesota is very cold, very unpleasant, and it's dangerous because there are bears. The electrical line workers are sitting around their break room one day, and one person says, you know, wouldn't it be great if we could get the bears to knock those icicles off for us so we didn't have to go out into the cold winter and do it? And they said, yeah, how are we going to do that? That's a stupid idea. Why are the bears going to knock the icicles off? And someone else said, I know what we're going to do. We're going to go hang buckets of honey off of the electrical lines. So the bears will climb up the poles, reach for the buckets, and knock off the icicles while they're reaching for the honey. One of his colleagues says, well, that's a dumb idea because who's going to go out in the cold winter and hang the buckets of honey? We're still going out in the winter. It didn't solve anything for us. And somebody else in the room says, oh, I know what we're going to do. We're going to fly in on helicopters, lower the buckets of honey on a line, hook them on the electrical lines, then the bears will climb up the poles, reach for the honey, knock off the icicles, and we won't have to be out in the cold. That's when somebody else in the room said, wait, if we fly helicopters over the electrical lines, the downdraft from the blades will knock the icicles off for us, and we can stay warm in our helicopter and not have to go out in the cold anymore. And to this day, that is how electrical line workers knock the icicles off the lines. They don't go out and endangering themselves with bears anymore. They just fly helicopters low over the lines, which knocks off all the icicles. The lesson there is you have to tolerate dumb, stupid, crazy, outside the box thinking to eventually get to a good idea if you want something creative to solve something. And so you have to tolerate those kinds of brainstorms in what you're doing. So we take that, the parable of the orange, the parable of the bear, and the metaphor of the onion, and we put it together in a different process that we call an interest-based process. So what this will do in its purest form, and there are many, many books that will teach this and many trainings you can go to, but it all basically will come down to a process like this. You will first start by creating a list of what your issues are. So you don't start with, here's my proposed solution. Instead, you start with, here's the problem I want to solve. And you just make a joint list of all the problems they want to solve and all the problems we want to solve. You then jointly select one of those issues, and you do it one issue at a time. So rather than getting a proposal on 125 different issues, we just take one issue at a time. And we first figure out what are the interests that are underlying it. That's what we know as the why. Why would you want any kind of solution to this particular issue? And you make sure you have a clear understanding, and they will often write what they call interest statements to make sure we understand what the interests are of both parties. You will then move to a brainstorming process where you will try to brainstorm what are all the different crazy ways that we might be able to solve this problem. You then have to find some way to jointly winnow and test all of those options. So I get a list. I've been in places where we've had 200 different options all written up on white paper that we've tacked up around the room. So I have 200 options. I now have to find a way to winnow that list down to something we can all agree upon. And there's lots of different tools we use that, various voting options, we can use a matrix to try to classify all of the options. What we're trying to do is to find which option is going to meet all of our interests, both the union's interests and ours. And we'll winnow that down and see if we can reach consensus from everybody on one solution. We'll then try to draft that solution. We often will do multiple drafts. We'll call the first draft like a straw design. We'll bring that back to everybody to look at. And then we'll take it to a wood design, and then we'll take it to brick, which means that it's a really much more firm idea that everyone can then vote for. And if there's consensus in the room, that becomes our solution on that issue. We set it aside and then move on to the next issue. And we do that with every single issue until we have a package of solutions for all of our issues that we've come together. As you might think, that takes a lot of time. And a lot of people lose patience with that process very quickly, which is why it's very hard to get people to commit to it. But it gives you a structured way to solve problems together. And so we do try to pursue this whenever we can. I can only do this when the union agrees to do it. If the union doesn't agree to do it, what I do something I call one-sided interest-based bargaining. So that's when they give me their proposals in a traditional format, then we go back in our caucus room and we do all of this process here. We figure out on our own, what was their interest underlying that proposal? Can we brainstorm other ways to meet that interest? That then becomes our counter proposal that we come back out with and we try to reach a consensus on. So I can still use this analytical framework, even if the other side doesn't want to use that process with me.
Is there, sorry to interrupt, Buzz, is there ever a point where you reach a tentative agreement on something and then down the list somewhere, in order to find a solution to another topic, you have to go back to a tentative agreement and readdress it?
Yes. Generally, to undo a TA you've already agreed to would be regressive bargaining. The exception to that is if you needed to, in order to get an agreement on something else, you have to undo a TA you did on something earlier. And that can definitely happen. It's why it makes actually a lot of those TAs on money issues very difficult. It's hard for me to know, can I afford a 100% increase in professional development on this particular issue until I know what the raise is going to be for their salaries. So often what we can do is either set aside that issue and not make a decision on the first one, or we can make a decision and say we might have to revisit this later once we figure out something else. A lot of the money issues like that, that's why they often get packaged together at the end, is because it's hard to make a decision on them one at a time. Okay, that's the process. What's the role of the board in that process? Number one, legally, what you have to do is define parameters. You have to tell your bargaining team what will and will not be acceptable to you, because I am not allowed to give my own personal opinions at the table on something when I represent you. I have to be able to represent what you will say yes to. And it will be an unfair labor practice if I say yes to something at the table and you say no when I bring it back to you, which means I kind of need to know what you will say yes or no to. And you don't usually want me to have to come back every single meeting and ask your opinion on every single issue. So we try to define parameters in a way that will help us understand what are the types of things that you would say yes or no to. And the way I do that is by doing it by getting interest-based rather than positional parameters. So a positional parameter would be something very specific on one issue. Like, it will be okay with you if we change the word shall to may on this sentence. That would be a very, very specific position you would be taking on something. But that's going to be a lot of guessing on my part if it's that particular, that precise. What would be better is for me to understand, why would you want it to say may versus shall? Or why would you want it to say shall versus may? If I understand the why, what your interest is, then I can be more creative in coming up with lots of different options as long as it meets your interest. So that's what I try to do is define the issues and the interests in a way that helps me understand your why, because then I don't have to come back to you. It's actually a lesson I learned in Everett. You know, I have bargained probably in 50 or 60 different districts in Washington. I've learned probably the most lessons from bargaining in Everett. And one of those lessons was, don't go back to the board unless you have to. Because when you do that, it just encourages the union to keep saying no to something and to send you back to the board, because they know you can always go back. I would rather go to the union and say, I have my parameters, and the board told me, don't come back until I get what they've asked for. Because then there's no opportunity for you to change your mind, because I really don't want you to change your mind, because then we're giving mixed messages, or we're not looking like we really mean what we say at the table. And that's what I really want. That's what I found to be most helpful, is when you say something at the table, you stick to it. And so I try not to say things that I'm going to have to back down from later, because that's going to then harm the credibility of the school district. If I told them there is no way in the world that we can do a 5% raise, and then a month later I find out there is a way for us to do that. So I try to be very careful not to make those kinds of broad statements that we would ever have to back down from. And so more important than knowing whether you would say yes or no to a 5% raise is what I will try to do is to say, why would you be saying yes or no to a 5% raise? What are the non-negotiables for you? So if it were, for example, we will never say yes to anything that would take our fund balance below 3%. And then I would have to know, why is a fund balance important to you? And if I understand that, that gives me a lot more options, because then I could say yes to a 5% raise if somebody gave up their professional development money that allowed us to afford a 5% raise, but still keep a fund balance that was within the range that you wanted. So knowing the why behind your positions is a lot more important to me than just knowing what positions you would take. I will tell you, this is what I see the role of the superintendent is. Whenever I'm in doubt about what the board might say on something, I like having a single point of contact that I can go to and say, hey, Ian, is this something the board's going to say yes or no to? And if Ian's not sure, then he can check in with you one-on-one and get back to me really quickly. And when it's a tight bargain at the end of August and we're trying to get school started, that's usually an easier way for us to communicate than to have to call a board meeting, put out an official notice, bring you all together, go through all of the issues. So that's how I try to understand your why and to get parameters. As I mentioned, we try to avoid those return trips to check on the parameters. Doesn't mean we won't come back and give you updates. We do. We try to make sure you're aware of where we are in the bargains. But I try to avoid drawing what are called artificial lines in the sand. And that, like I said, that was my Everett lesson. I think that was the 2001 bargain that I had to learn very clearly, that once I tell the union there's a line in the sand that we will not cross, for the union, it just becomes a game of trying to prove to me that they can make us cross that line. And that's the game that EEA liked to play back in the early 2000s, is to prove to you that you're not really going to hold that line. I can always make you cross the line. So what I have found is we can stick to our interests better than we can stick to our positions. So I try to never draw an artificial line in the sand that somebody can just push us over. But if I know your interest, I can tell them we will never compromise our interest. That's the underlying need that we have behind. So if we have a need, for example, to teach students, I'm never going to agree to a proposal that won't allow us to teach students to the best of our ability. And that's what we'll focus on, not saying yes or no to any particular proposal, but never compromising our interests. So that's how I try to avoid drawing artificial lines. As I mentioned, you have a duty to ratify any tentative agreements. If they're within the parameters that you gave us, you have to say yes to it. It becomes an unfair labor practice for you not to ratify something that we said yes to at the table when it was within the parameters you gave us. So that's why it's very important that we understand parameters. That's the first role of the board, set our parameters. And that's the one we're going to practice doing right after this meeting. The second one is to maintain a steady eye on that big picture and vision. What I have found in bargaining is that bargaining is a very crazy emotional roller coaster. It's these moments of hope and moments of deflation. I think we're going to settle today. Oh, I think we'll never settle. Oh, I think we're going to settle today. Oh, I think we're never going to settle. If I take every person in the district on that ride, we're all going up or down, and everybody gets queasy, and nobody keeps their eye on that big picture of where are we trying to get? What is the strategic vision of where we're going? What were our interests? Because everybody on the roller coaster, which is the bargaining team, all of us on the bargaining team are riding that roller coaster up and down. We need somebody to be that backstop for us, somebody to say, hey, this is why we're doing this. These are our interests. Let's remind you of that big picture and that vision. And I think that's a really good role the board can serve for us. When they're not sitting at the table, it's good for you to keep our eyes on where are we headed? Why are we going there? That's what we will never compromise on. And when you're not at the table, it's a lot easier to do that. So I think that's a really good role for the board. That's why we focus on parameters, to avoid that emotional roller coaster of the day-to-day bargaining. It's also, I'll tell you, an important leadership personality trait. When you show organizational stability, when you're not coming up and down emotionally with us, it's a lot easier to follow you. And so as being the leaders for the district, I really do encourage you to keep your eye on that big picture of where are we going and how are we going to get there. That's really important for us. Next role of the board, I'm going to talk about helpful behaviors, how boards act during a bargain. What's helpful is confidentiality. I can't require it of you. Your other board members might be able to, but I can't. But I will tell you it is very helpful. Every time we have a conversation in a closed session about bargaining, about where we might be going on a particular issue, and then it gets leaked out somewhere, it starts creating ripple effects. And sometimes it's not, a ripple effect that is harmful to our position. It could be harmful to the union's position, because we let out that the union told us, for example, that they might be willing to compromise on an issue that they told their members they would never compromise on. And if that gets out, I've all of a sudden embarrassed the union in front of their members, and it's much less likely they're going to compromise with me now. So I believe that what I call the laboratory environment of bargaining, if I can create this pristine environment that we all walk in, and we don't walk out until we have a deal, and we don't allow the outside world to impact what we're doing, it can very much be easier to get a deal. And confidentiality helps that. When I'm worrying instead about all of the messaging that's going on, that becomes a distraction from trying to get a deal. And that happens often. You know, we send out an update to the community. I have some boards who really like this. They like to post all of their bargaining proposals on the website. They like to put out a press release with every single proposal to let the world know what we're doing, because they think that daylighting everything is going to make it easier. I find I spend the next hour or two of the next bargaining session trying to reassure the union that we can still get a deal, because they're so mad about all of that particular messaging that went out that was trying to embarrass them into agreeing to something. And so I end up wasting a couple of hours where I could be trying to reach an agreement, just trying to unravel everybody's emotions that are upset over that particular press release. So I believe strongly in trying to not have distractions from our goal, which is to get an agreement. So I don't like a lot of communication outside of what we're doing to you. I like confidentiality. I can't require you to agree with one another, but I will tell you that it is helpful. If you can have unity and consensus among you, that makes it easier for me to represent you. You don't have a requirement to do that. Technically, as your lawyer, I'm directed by whichever 3 votes that 3 of you can put together. But it's better if I can get all 5 of you agreeing together and can show consensus on something. And consensus doesn't always mean it's my preferred choice, but it's something I can live with and I can vote for. That is helpful to us, because splits within a leadership become a distracting sideshow. It becomes another way we just end up wasting time. Calm and patience helps. The more we react to external pressure, the more it's going to be used. This is another lesson I learned in Everett, that when there was no emotional reaction to the game playing that was going on, they stopped because that tactic wasn't getting what they wanted. So one of the rules when I'm teaching a philosophy of bargaining was, I call it the turn the other cheek philosophy. Obviously there's a biblical allusion there, but I found practically it works. When they send some hit piece out that says, district is so mean, they want to lay us all off and take away our salaries, even when it's not true. The more time I spend responding to it, the more often they're going to send those kinds of lies out, because they see that it distracts us from trying to reach an agreement. When I stop responding and I let them say everything untrue or mean about me in the world, and that tactic is not going to work, and I just turn the other cheek and say, hit me harder, they stop doing that tactic because it didn't get them what they wanted. So I tend to ignore all of the communication games that go on, and I don't play them. I keep my focus on getting a deal at the table, not on what is being done to harm somebody's particular reputation on something. Now, I will admit that you do need public support, not just to get your own selves elected to the board, but we need the public to support us on levies. So I know I can't ignore that maintaining public support is an important interest that you have. And so there will be times that we communicate with the public, but I will tell you that you'll probably see me try to convince you as much as possible not to, because I do find it's harmful to the bargaining process. So there are some, and this is a controversial point for some school districts, because they would like very much, they think, to bargain in the public, open everything up. And I have found that actually makes it harder to get a deal, not easier to get a deal, because they think that putting it in the public is going to embarrass the other side into being more reasonable, and it just does the opposite. It usually drives the real bargain underground, and we have a fake bargain that goes on in the public. It's sort of like bargaining the state budget. Our legislature, who is not subject to the Open Public Meetings Act, refuses to bargain the budget in the public. They each put out a proposal, usually the day it gets voted on. And why is that? It's because it's a really hard decision to make, and people are having to make compromises they don't want to make. They're having to not give as many counselor funding FTEs to school districts that they want to. They can't fund the social services they want to. And so they often have to back down from positions they have taken politically. If we required them to bargain the state budget in the public, we probably would never get a state budget. The only way they can do that is by having a few people go off into some private room, make some really tough deals, and then come back out and announce it, and everybody votes on the whole package. And the press and the public can complain about it, that it was all done in secret. I can complain about it because it was all done in secret and I didn't know about it till the last day it comes out. But I understand why they did it that way. It's because it's a really hard decision, and those hard decisions are easier to make when I'm doing it in private. I'm asking people to make compromises in private than embarrassing them in the public over it. So calm and patience, unity and consensus, confidentiality, those are the helpful behaviors. The last one is respect for the process. So if people try to talk to you about the bargaining process, I would encourage you to use phrases such as, I very much appreciate hearing your perspective. I will make sure that our bargaining teams deal with the bargaining issues at the bargaining table. So you have to refuse to, in the grocery store, when somebody stops you in the aisle and says, hey, can I ask you why you aren't giving a 10% raise to teachers? You have to decline to bargain there, because the more you start bargaining in the public with individual people out there, the more it could be an unfair labor practice by going around their bargaining rep, or it could just be distracting to trying to reach a deal. Because now the next time I sit down at the bargaining table, the union rep is going to say, hey, why is your board member out there telling everybody that you're never going to agree to a raise? Or why is your board member saying they would agree to a 5% raise when you told me you could only do a 3%? And we end up wasting a lot of time at the bargaining table trying to unravel what was or wasn't said at the grocery store. So just try to respect that there is a process going on. There are unhelpful behaviors as well, things that have been unfair labor practices when board members do them, such as interference. If we get involved in the internal affairs of the union, such as trying to promote one person to be president of the union versus the other, that can be an interference violation, an unfair labor practice. So we try not to get involved in their internal affairs. They pick who they want to send to the table, I don't. Number two, retaliation. That's discriminating against somebody because they were involved in union activity. I don't like the position sometimes the union leaders take, but I'm not going to give them the worst assignment in the district or try to lay them off because they're a union leader. That would be an unfair labor practice. That would be retaliation for being involved in the union. Bad faith bargaining, we talked about that before. If we're deceptive or we have regressive behaviors, the organization can get tagged with an unfair labor practice for that. Inconsistency, changing your position, that's also bad faith bargaining. And the last one is an attempt to be a hero during a strike. I very much believe there is no one person who makes a bargain go well. It is a team of people, all of whom have different skills that are going to be used at a particular time. Sometimes when we've been involved in strike situations, I've seen this happen a couple of times where one board member thinks they are so popular with the community, I can step in and solve this for everybody. And they will invite the union president out for coffee and think they're going to settle the deal just between the two of them. That often leads to the other board members now suspecting that their one board member is going rogue and no longer trusting them. It will lead to the members of the union believing their president is going rogue and not representing them anymore, doing all of these side deals with somebody. So I have not found that being the hero during the strike has ever worked. It is usually extended strikes an extra week while we have unraveled all of those bad feelings from those particular attempts. Okay, I've run through that in 1 hour. That's my blunt overview of the board's role in bargaining. Any questions you want answered?
So let's say it's been a particularly egregious bargaining process, and going back to your turn the other cheek philosophy, and the union's just been pushing out kind of outlandish, kind of superfluous things into the media. Is there any point during the bargaining where you would say, okay, we will agree to X, Y, and Z, but you need to retract this information? You need to come out and say that this was not true.
So I've tried that before. I've been asked to give that kind of an offer. What that usually does is signal to the other side that those communications really bothered us. And so what they do is they then put that in their toolbox and say, next time I want to get the district distracted, I just have to send out messages that are really egregious and untrue. So I would rather not let them know that those messages bothered us. I would rather not go in and ask them to retract something. Have we done it? Sometimes, yes. There are times where we both have seen that miscommunication has caused a problem. What I would rather do is have a relationship where we can send communications out jointly, sort of in the best place, that interest-based process where it's all kumbaya and we're all one team solving problems together and not two separate teams. I've actually seen some district and unions come together and present the final agreement together. We will go in front of the whole union membership and all of the administrators, and together we will all say, this was our joint agreement we reached. That's sort of the best communication, because then it's not an us versus them communication. Look what we got you. It's look what we together, the district and the union, did together. And so if I can't get there very often, but I try. That's what I push for, is to develop the relationship where we both send out the same message. So even when we're not in that wonderful kumbaya world, I will still, at the end of a lot of bargaining sessions in a traditional bargain, talk to the union and ask, what will you guys be sending out? Can we at least know what you're going to say before you say it? And we'll agree, we'll try to agree upon what's the common message we're both going to send. Like, we've been working on this new creative solution to something here, and we know that we're not sure if it's going to be accepted or not. So both of us have to go back and check with somebody to find out if we can afford it, or to find out if their members will accept it. But we're worried that that communication message might actually go south if somebody hears that we're considering doing this. So we will try to coordinate messages. And that's kind of the best place to be, is when you can coordinate with the other side, so you know what they'll be saying and they know what we'll be saying about something. We push forward whenever we can on that.
I appreciate that. Is that in recent history, is that kind of more often than not what we're able to do, is kind of issue joint statements at the end of the process and say, these are all the things that we were able to accomplish and resolve as a team?
Yeah, I would say lately, so over the last 5 years, things have moved in that direction a lot more. I won't say that it's 100% always there, but we're in a place where that's definitely a possibility. I would say with almost all of our unions. On the classified side, we still have some very traditional unions who represent some of our groups there, who aren't comfortable with any part of that process at all. And they get very suspicious when I ask them to send a joint message out. I will tell you that's usually their union leaders. Our employees, school employees, tend to be very collaborative people on almost all of our bargaining units. So it actually comes very natural, I think, to school employees to want to do something collaboratively and jointly. And on our teacher side, we have moved in that direction significantly over the last 5 years.
Thank you, Buzz. That was very informative for me. Thank you.
Anything else?
No other questions from directors? Okay, well, I want to thank you, Buzz, for spending time with us here this morning and leading us through this. I find these, although it's a bit of a review for some of us, it's a really good review and a good reminder of how we go about this work. So thank you. And any further comments from Dr. Salzman?
Buzz, I want to thank you so much. Very informative. You just do amazing work, but this is really helpful for all our board members and especially for our new ones as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Buzz. So
Oh, go ahead.
go ahead, President Mason.
I was just going to mention, I think what you were about to say is at this point, we're going to go ahead and adjourn this meeting, and we will move into closed session. So we will all want to log off this meeting, and similar to our other special meeting, there's a second link in our email that we'll want to log back in on. Was that what you were going to say, Debbie? Okay, so go ahead and we'll adjourn, and we'll see you all soon in just a minute.